Thank you so much for having me. You can start the slides. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this opportunity to come and speak with you today about the important work that Pew has done and continues to do to help improve criminal justice practices and policies across the U.S. In the U.S. today, there are about 1.2 million people in state and federal prisons and about 750,000 people in local jails. This costs U.S. taxpayers about $100 billion per year. While efforts to reduce these populations has met some success as a result of both policy changes and decreases in arrests and crime, there is more work to be done. In this presentation, I'll review some of the key data around U.S. correctional populations, share some of the work that we at Pew and our collaborators have done to reduce prison and jail populations, and share some recent innovations that we are seeing here in the U.S. For more than 12 years, the Pew Charitable Trust has compiled a significant body of research on policies to protect public safety while reducing correctional control and spending by shifting resources into those strategies that reduce recidivism in the most cost-effective manner. This research benefits from the work of Pew and its partners in nearly 36 states that have adopted bipartisan reforms. These states have shown that reducing prison populations and reinvesting savings in evidence-based recidivism reduction programs offer better returns on public safety spending. The Public Safety Performance Project continues to help advance fiscally sound, data-driven policies and practices in criminal and juvenile justice to improve outcomes for the public, government, and system-involved individuals. Our staff work with individual states and localities to implement targeted, evidence-based solutions to the most pressing public safety challenges. Recently, Pew has ramped up our focus on the areas of jail and community supervision, and we continue to do that work. Next slide. As you can see, the cost of incarceration in the US is about $100 billion annually. From our analysis, our local jails cost approximately $25 billion in 2018. This does not include the cost of courts, of law enforcement, or any state support for jails. This is just the cost of incarcerating individuals. State corrections spending in FY 2020 totaled $66 billion. Our Federal Bureau of Prisons, which manage persons who are convicted of federal crimes, US government crimes, their spending in 2020 was just under $8 billion. This is approximately $532 billion. When you total all of it up, the costs for corrections in the US are astronomical. And one of the challenges that Pew has been tasked with by our government and our partners is how do we conduct research that brings those costs down. Next slide. As you can see from this chart, rates of correctional control in the US have remained relatively flat, with some slight decreases during the pandemic. I'd also like to point out to you on this chart that the largest group of people under correctional control are those being supervised in the community by our probation and parole departments, with about 4.4 million people under supervision, followed by state and federal prisons and local jails. And so you can see while our incarcerated population is pretty big throughout the US, the number of people who are subject to incarceration because they're on community supervision, either probation, which means that they were sentenced to a term of community supervision in lieu of incarceration, or parole, which indicates that they've served a period of incarceration, but they continue to be monitored for a specific time frame. those numbers are increasingly high, which is one of the reasons, and I'll talk about this later, why we made a decision to start looking at that 4.4 million people population to see if there was policies and research that we could do to reduce the number of who are impacted by the system. Next slide, please. As you can see from this chart, the rates of correctional control in the U.S. Oh, I'm sorry, I have the wrong slide. Okay, the U.S. saw significant drops in crime among both juveniles and adults between 2018 and 2019. Our preliminary data suggests that these declines may be reversing since COVID-19. As we see the pandemic start to shift and the impact of the pandemic is certainly not as intense as it was in the beginning, we can see some of the declines in crime throughout the U.S. have started to go up, particularly around violent crime and dangerous crime. And we are hoping that the number of incarcerated people doesn't go up with this crime rate. And so we are actively looking at solutions to the rise in crime population. One of the things that's under consideration in the U.S. is what do we do about this rise in violent crime? The number of murders and aggravated assaults seems to be increasing. And that is an area that we continue to look at in an effort to reduce the correctional population throughout the U.S. Next slide, please. Our state prison, our state prison populations have been falling the past few years. It should be noted here that this decrease coincides with COVID, as I mentioned previously. During the pandemic, many states engaged in efforts to reduce their prison populations to stem the spread of the virus. This was done with little documented negative impact on public safety. In other words, those released early due to the pandemic were not arrested for new crimes at a significant rate. Pew and other advocates throughout the US are using this as a talking point for continued shrinking of the prison population. There was a lot of concern throughout the US during the pandemic about reducing the prison and the jail populations in response to the pandemic. But I think the states and the federal government were left with very little choices. Initially, the virus was running rampant through correctional facilities, and in order to stem that spread of the virus, the decision was made to release those nonviolent, low-level persons back into the community. In some instances, it was a temporary release with the people being subject to return to prison. In some instances, it was just a complete sentence reduction and people were released without the need or the requirement that they would have to return. And what we saw from that, we tracked it pretty closely. What we saw from that is that those who were released were not arrested for new crimes at a significant rate. And so we're making an argument based on that information and based on that data that in fact, more people can be released safely back into the community from periods of incarceration. Next slide, please. I'd now like to talk about Pew's most recent state initiative, which focused on local jail populations in the state of Michigan. Michigan had one of the highest rates of incarceration in its local jails. In the states in the US, the local jails, when you're first arrested, they hold the majority of those people. And each state has a number of, each state has a number of counties, and each county has its own jail. And so in Michigan, there were 86 counties with about 78 to 80 jails. Some counties share a jail, but there are a lot of jails in the state of Michigan. And so Pew thought it would be really interesting to go into the state and to help them to find ways to reduce that population and to reduce the cost of incarcerating so many people at the local level. And many of those people haven't been convicted of criminal offenses. They're simply there awaiting trial. Next slide, please. So strategies to reduce prison populations, the Justice Reinvestment Act. Pugh's previous work focused on sentencing reform, reducing revocations to prison from community-based supervision, and securing compassionate release for elderly or sick inmates. Our most recent work has focused primarily on reducing jail population and improving community-based supervision. I mentioned the Justice Reinvestment Act or Justice Reinvestment Initiative. That is an initiative where the federal government funded states to find ways to reduce their prison populations and to take the savings and to invest those savings into programs that could prevent arrests and prevent criminal behavior, such as drug treatment programs, such as early intervention programs, even education programs, in order to reduce that population. So we wanted to use the savings from reducing the prison population and apply that savings to more preventive efforts. I mean, we saw a lot of success in many, many states throughout the country. So we applied that same strategy to our Michigan work. Next slide, please. All right. And so strategies to reduce our populations in Michigan, the reform, we focused on treating traffic violations and other misdemeanors as civil infractions rather than criminal offenses. The US Criminal Code is steeped with any number of violations and things that can land a person in jail or prison. And so what we wanted to do was talk about some of these offenses perhaps not being criminalized, but finding other ways to get accountability for those offenses. So more than 60% of Michigan jail admissions were for misdemeanors or low-level crimes. According to our data from 2016 and 2018, our reforms decriminalized some of those minor offenses that collectively clogged up the criminal justice system. Despite posing little risk to the public, the law now classifies certain violations related to operating motor vehicles, including licenses and noise infractions, as civil infractions as opposed to criminal. And so we were able to reduce that number of people who were in the jail. Increasing the use of alternatives of arrest, failing to appear for court. So those who were scheduled to return to court for a court appearance was the #1 reason for arrest in the state of Michigan in 2018. The courts are now expected to use a summons rather than issuing arrest warrants. So they simply send out a notice ordering the person to appear as opposed to issuing an arrest warrant, which would land the person back into jail. For first-time failure to appear offenses, those who already have active warrants for missing court dates can, in most cases, resolve the issue without fear of being immediately arrested and sent back to jail simply by visiting the courthouse. And if they've set up offices throughout the courthouses with people who have arrest warrants, where they can come in, get those warrants resolved, and get new court dates scheduled. The reforms also give police the discretion to issue tickets for some offenses. So rather than the police being forced to arrest and incarcerate, the police can simply give the person a ticket or notice, informing them when they need to appear in court. And then also, one of the things that we did was we created a presumption of non-jail sentences for most misdemeanors. So in Michigan and throughout the US, persons who are convicted of misdemeanors, simple thefts, or what we call minor crimes, they end up in jail. And these reforms in Michigan created an expectation in the law that those convicted of misdemeanors, the sentences will allow people to continue to work and otherwise contribute to their families and communities. Judges must use jail alternatives such as fines and/or probation. They must go on record with reasonable grounds for doing so to facilitate an appeal. And so the law now stipulates that judges look for alternatives or consider alternatives to jail for those convicted of lower level misdemeanor offenses. And then finally, the reforms that we did in Michigan improved our probation process. Michigan had the 6th highest share of people on community supervision in the country. The reforms reduced the maximum probation term for most felonies to 3 years. So the longest period you can be on probation now in the state of Michigan is 3 years. Just as an example, prior to the reform, you could be on probation for up to 20 years, which increases your likelihood of making a mistake and ending up back incarcerated. And so the reforms also increased incentives for people on probation to comply with their conditions by establishing earned discharge policy. So one of the things that we've been pushing this throughout the country, we saw it enacted in Michigan, and we don't have the data yet. This is relatively new, well, actually very new in the last year. But we've tried to get our community supervision agencies in the US to adopt policies that for the longer people are on supervision successfully without committing violations or infractions, then they earn time to come off early. So if you're on for 30 days, if you're on for 30 days of compliant behavior, you get 30 days early discharge. And so that's a kind of innovative project that we've been pushing throughout the country, and we're seeing it to reduce prison and jail populations as well. Next slide, please. So there's a few other recent policy reforms to reduce our prison and jail populations that I'd like to talk about. Next slide, please. So in jails, which is, again, that first step in when you are introduced into the criminal justice system, we've been pushing to reduce the use of money bail for pretrial release. So fewer people in jail solely because of the inability to pay, which is a huge issue in the US. If you get arrested in the US, in most jurisdictions, in order to get out while you await your trial, you have to pay a monetary bond. This disproportionately impacts poor people and low-income people, and it does not protect the public. And so, just by way of example, if you have a very dangerous person who gets arrested and he can afford to pay the bond, he gets out. By contrast, if you have a person who's low risk and no threat to the community, they happen to get arrested, they have to stay in jail because they can't pay. And so we've been pushing pretrial reform throughout the country, improving crisis response systems for people with behavioral health problems so that they receive mental health and drug treatment instead of going to jail. I know in the US, there is a huge problem with finding services for people who suffer from mental illness. And so we've been working diligently across the country on projects and programs to reduce the number of people who are incarcerated, particularly at our local jails, because our jails are not equipped to manage this population. We've been working to reduce that number. And so we've been working with crisis response teams from throughout the country in order to find alternatives to safely manage the population of people who have mental health problems and who are addicted to illegal substances. And then we've instituted court innovations like text reminders and continuing virtual hearings that we started during COVID to reduce the number of people who failed to appear. As I mentioned, failure to appear was the #1 reason why people were in Michigan's jails. And so as we work to reduce the number of people who fail to appear in court, then we reduce the number of people who end up in jail. And so we've been working and we continue to work on projects that reduce that number. And what we find, the research in the US finds that oftentimes people simply forget about court dates. And you end up getting a brand new criminal charge because you simply forgot about a court date. And so we've instituted different types of reminders. During the pandemic, many jurisdictions went to virtual hearings, court hearings. And what we found is that they were just as effective as in-person hearings. And so we are encouraging courts throughout the US to continue holding these virtual hearings so that we can reduce the number of people who fail to appear and we can reduce the caseload for our judges and magistrates. Next slide, please. Our prison population, clemency for individuals released during the pandemic. As I mentioned before, we saw a lot of people get early release during the pandemic, and we saw very insignificant impact on public safety. And so we want to continue to encourage jurisdictions to provide clemency for individuals who are incarcerated. We also want to expand parole eligibility to include more offenses. In the US, parole has really, in a lot of instances, been eliminated or strictly restricted. And so we want to expand the number of people who are eligible for early release. And we've seen that in Mississippi, which is one of the highest incarcerators in the country. We've seen them to expand that and to reduce their population. And then reducing prison sentences for people convicted of their first violent offense. And so we saw this in Louisiana, where they were able to reduce their prison population by simply reducing the sentences for those convicted of a first-time violent offense. Next slide, please. That's the end of my presentation. I don't know if there are any questions. We're taking questions now or at the end, but I'm happy to do so. And I've put my email address there and our website for our public safety performance project. We have a host of research and data reports on our website. I would encourage you to take a look at those, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have any specific questions or needs. Thank you.